it's great to be here in Amsterdam to talk to you guys. I do have to say, I came down with a really bad cold while I've been here in Amsterdam. Last night, I almost completely lost my voice. But fortunately, I went to a doctor this morning. He gave me some really strong drugs. So hopefully, hopefully I can make it through this talk. You'll have to excuse me if I need to drink some water or clear my throat or anything like that. I have given a lot of talks, but somehow it feels very appropriate that I am on drugs for my Amsterdam talk. So actually, before we get going, does anybody know what this is a picture of? This is a very incredible place in the world. Sorry, did someone yell? Yeah, China, that's right. This is one of the ghost cities in China. China decided that they would build many, many cities without anyone prepared to live there. And it turns out once they thought that once they built them that people would come live in the city, but that didn't work out. So this is a city, but all those buildings are completely empty. They're ghost cities. And it's one of the most extreme examples I know of that the philosophy of build it and they will come is completely false. And this has a lot to do, in my experience, or it's very related to open source development for programming. So I'll be talking about how to approach your career in a different way as a programmer. In my life, my big turning point was in December of 2009, and I had a total change in philosophy that month, a very explicit, carefully thought out change about how I would approach my career. And what I did that month is I started a blog, I got on Twitter, and then I quit my job and I joined as the first employee of a startup. And the reason why I joined as the first employee of a startup was so that I would have total freedom when it came to participating in and creating and contributing to open source. And that's what I was really placing my bet on. And that's the point I really want to get across today. And that decision was the biggest and most important decision of my life. Well, we'll get to the reasons why. So, before I made this decision, I was on the standard career path of a programmer. I was thinking about my career in a very traditional way. And on the standard career path, you work for a company, some company, and then the work that you do belongs to the company. And most importantly, it is hidden in the walls of the company. No one really knows what you're doing except for the people in the company. Excuse me. Now, you putting your work on your LinkedIn profile, that's not really showing the work that you do. That's not seeing the code you do. It's not seeing the quality of your work. It's so indirect as to really tell you almost nothing about what you actually do. Now, on the standard career path, I'm going to try talking a little softer. When you want to get a new or better job, you go and you interview, you apply, and you go through a very long, time-intensive, and expensive process in terms of time to get that new opportunity. Now, occasionally, you are able to, besides just applying randomly to new jobs, Sometimes you can leverage the network of people that you've worked with before for new opportunities. So you have someone that you used to work with who now works at another company, and they can give you an inside track at that new company, which is a very different way to get a job than just kind of standardly applying for a job. But this, by definition, these kinds of opportunities are by definition small, because there's a very small number of people that you've worked with closely in the past. Now, I think there's major, major problems with the standard career path. Problems that are big enough that it's a good idea to think of ways to avoid these problems and different ways to approach your career. So the first one, and I've alluded to this already, is that your value is hidden. No one knows how good you are at what you do. And what this means is that the job marketplace for programmers doesn't function like a normal market. A normal market functions because people know what goods are in the market and what the value is of the goods. So, for example, let's say you were the best programmer, you were objectively the best programmer in the world, and the market wasn't how it is. And let's say everyone knew that you were the best programmer in the world, every single person in company. Then what would happen is that normal market forces would compete very heavily for you, and then you would get priced the highest of any programmer in the world. And by pricing, I don't just mean money, although obviously that's part of it. I also mean like anything that goes into your enjoyment in your career. So it could be where you work, how you work, maybe you want to work remotely. So kind of all those things. The kind of work you do, how interesting it is. Those are the kinds of things that reward us as programmers besides just money. But of course, the market doesn't function that way. Whoever the best programmer is in the world, no one really knows. And the market doesn't work this way. Now, another problem with the standard career path, and this is actually related to the first problem, is that standard interviewing practices are wildly inaccurate. And of course, by standard interviewing practices, I'm talking about the whiteboard coding interview. Whenever I even think about the whiteboard coding interview, it kind of riles me up a little bit inside. Because the whiteboard coding interview, whatever results it gives about a candidate has nothing to do with how good that candidate will be at the job. Because a whiteboard coding interview, it's not testing what we do as programmers. Like, first of all, when we program, we're not doing it in a room with someone watching you with time pressure. You only have a limited amount of time to solve these problems. You're not on a computer, you're writing on a freaking whiteboard. Like, it blows my mind that most companies make people actually write by hand when we don't do that ever in our job. The kinds of problems you work on in the whiteboard coding interview, it's usually some like cute algorithm problem, like a search problem or like the classic reversing a linked list. And this is not what we do as programmers. We don't sit there all day solving cute little algorithm problems. It's actually very rare that we even have to develop a new algorithm instead of just reusing one that's already been developed. Like, most of programming is forming good abstractions and putting things together to minimize complexity. It's about putting together a web server and a database and a monitoring system and a deployment system into a robust application. Absolutely none of that stuff is tested in the whiteboard coding interview. So I personally long ago abandoned the whiteboard coding interview in favor of doing take-home projects, which are a much better way to know what are someone's skills. It's not perfect, but at least the person can do the project at home on their computer. They can look up documentation, and it's usually it's like a 3 to 4 hour project, so it's involved enough that you can see how do they test the code, how they put abstractions together. It's just like infinitely better than the whiteboard coding interview. What actually caused me to abandon it is that there were 2 people that I interviewed, and I knew about them through open source stuff. Like, I already knew that they were strong, but I was still under this weird spell that the whole industry is in, that when you're interviewing someone for a job, you give them the whiteboard coding interview. I remember both these people, who are two of the strongest programmers I've ever known, looked like complete morons in this interview. Like, it was almost comical just how bad. They looked like they'd never programmed before in their life. And we've talked about it since then. We've become friends since then. And they just said they got nervous because it's a very nerve-inducing situation, the coding interview, which is another reason, besides the one I've mentioned, for why it's so bad. Okay, I think I'll stop ranting about that. I think I've made my point. But kind of where this all ties into with, think about your career. So first of all, your value is not public, because the work you do is in the walls of your company. And then second of all, when a company tries to evaluate you and put a value on you, the methods they're using do not value you correctly. So it makes the whole job market function in a very weird way, and also in a very non-meritocratic way. So the last thing I want to mention about the problems with the standard career path is that as a programmer looking to join a company, it's actually pretty hard to evaluate a company and know whether you'll be happy working there. Like, the only really tangible things that you know before you make a decision are, is the compensation good, and do you like the office? There's so much more about the company, which is so important, that you can't really know in the interview process. Like, it's hard to know how good are the engineers there, like how are the processes they use, are they good, are they sensible, do they micromanage, do they not? How's the management, how good is the product team? How does the company tolerate assholes on the team? What do they do about that? Do they let people just, there's a lot of like patterns of behavior where people, aren't pleasant to work with. And I'm sure everyone in this room has worked with someone like that. And you can't know what you're getting yourself into until you take the job. And that's kind of innate to how the standard career path works. Another thing I will say is that I have seen a lot of people, I'm only 31 years old, but I have already seen way too many people fall for the trap of optimizing the things that they can optimize, the things that are quantifiable. And in this case, the thing that's quantifiable is how much you're getting paid. And what I've seen is that if you live your life optimizing for that, because that's the one thing that's quantifiable that you can optimize for, it leads to, in many cases, just leads to misery. It's important to find a better way to do this. Now, when you take the standard career path, most of the opportunities you have are what are called outbound opportunities. And so an outbound opportunity means that you have to go out and get the opportunity for yourself. The opportunity does not come to you. If you want a job, you have to apply, and you have to interview, and you have to make it happen for yourself, and it's very intensive. The opposite of this, of an outbound opportunity, is an inbound opportunity. It's an opportunity that comes to you. So for example, like me coming here to this conference was an inbound opportunity for me. Codemotion invited me to come speak to you guys, which was really cool, but I didn't have to do anything. I just got an email in my inbox one day. And the real crux of my talk is that when you take the standard career path, you have basically no inbound opportunities. When you do things differently, you can get a lot of inbound opportunities, and those inbound opportunities are, I have found, to be the most awesome and the most impactful for your life, and really make you just have a better career and be a happier person. The best term I heard for this, I read this, I don't remember exactly where I read it. The term was luck surface area. So the idea is that the more you put yourself out there and the more you contribute value to the world and just make it known, then you increase your luck surface area. You increase the chance that something serendipitous will happen, that some awesome opportunity will come to you. So again, to use myself as an example, I get to come to lots of conferences because of my luck surface area. I ended up writing my book because my publisher contacted me because of some open source work that I did. I have a bunch of companies that I advise doing really cool stuff. Again, they know me through my open source work, and I've gotten to know the founders through my open source work. All stuff that came to me just because I've optimized my career to give value to the world, and then see what the world gives back. So the way, and this is what I'm getting at, is it's think about your career so that you try to make as much of your work as public as possible, and the center of that should be contributing to open source. Now the start for me was in December 2009, as I mentioned, and it was kind of a pathetic start. I got on Twitter, I didn't know anyone, so I had like 80 Twitter followers. I had a brand new blog which no one in the world knew about, and at that point, my involvement in open source was fairly minimal. But I will say that this pathetic start and this change in philosophy I had inevitably led me to where I am today. And I'm just I've had a lot more success than I would have had, and I'm also just a much happier person than I would have been. So my plan at that time was a very simple plan. My plan was to blog every 1 to 2 weeks, just no matter what, write some blog, think of something to write about and publish it, and then try to get people to read it. And the second and the most important one was to have as much of my work be open source as possible. And as I mentioned, that's the reason why I quit my job and joined a 2-person startup, was so that I would have total freedom with that aspect. And actually, I actually looked back, in that first year, I wrote 27 blog posts, which was about once every 2 weeks. And it really had a big effect. So one of the first things I found is that there's this virtuous cycle that works in your favor. There's a virtuous cycle between blogging, Twitter, doing conferences, and doing open source. So basically, let's say you write a blog post. So this was actually the first blog post I ever wrote. So you write a blog post and no one knows you yet, but some people know you. And so I posted it on Twitter, and some people read it, some people retweet it. And so new people get exposed to my blog post. And then your blog, like here on my blog, I have links to follow me on various places on the web, including Twitter. So when you write a blog post, some people will like it, and then you'll get new Twitter followers, which means that the next time you write a blog post, you'll have even more reach. And so as long as you stick to it and keep writing, your reach can grow. Now, the goal of this is not to just get as many Twitter followers as possible. That would be a stupid goal and a pointless goal to have. Having a following is a means to an end. And it's a means to being able to make your work as public as possible, so that when you do something, and you do something that's valuable and interesting, a lot of people can be exposed to it, and so it can permeate through the developer community, which then raises your luck surface area and creates opportunities for you. Another thing I'll say about Twitter is that I actually view Twitter differently than most people. For me, what Twitter is the greatest networking tool ever devised. Because when you operate your life in this way of doing open source and blogging and trying to just give value to the world, there's other people in the world doing this or doing the same thing, and you will definitely come across them. And you'll probably follow each other if you find each other's work interesting. And so you get to know some really smart people when you live your life in this way. And they get to know you too. They'll find you interesting because you've done some interesting things. So like when I go to a conference, a lot of people go to conferences. I'm sure a lot of people here have been doing this all day today. You kind of bump into random people and you talk and you say, oh, hey, so where do you work, right? Like the conversation starts very shallow, and it's hard to get those really cool connections. So what I do is I actually know I already know which people that I find interesting that are going to be going to the conference, because I know about them through Twitter and through them blogging and them doing open source. So then I use Twitter to know who I should meet, And then when we meet each other in person, we have a lot to talk about because we're already familiar with each other. And so I've found Twitter to just be an incredible networking tool when you use it in that way. So as I said, the main reason I changed my job back in December 2009 was so that I'd have total freedom with respect to open source. And that was the best decision I ever made in my life. My old job had a very outdated mindset, but it's a mindset that's still pretty prevalent in the programming world, which is the idea that any code your employees produce is your company's hard-earned IP, and it must be protected at all costs. So what I found is that I actually had a lot of ideas for open source stuff, or things that I could make open source at my old company, and I was getting blocked by the company because they were worried about we're giving code away for free, and like, should we do this? What do we really get back? I actually think that's a very outdated mindset, and I think a company is stupid to think of it in that way. But that's how it was, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room work at companies that think that way. So I find that the first thing you have to do if you want to change your philosophy and make your work public and increase your luck surface area is you have to get a job where you will have freedom with open source. Now, for me, it was pretty extreme. I joined a 2-person startup. I don't think you always have to do that. But it is important to find a more progressive company that thinks about these things in a more liberal way. Now, the reason open source is so impactful for your career is because it's a public display of value. It is real code that you've produced that does real things. If a company is smart, they will look at your open source, or they will know you through your open source. Or more likely, the people who use these projects or who work on them as well and are familiar with the good work that you're doing will now know you because you've been contributing all this awesome code. Another really useful thing about open source is it gives you things to write and speak about. So it feeds into that blogging and making your value public and getting reach and distribution on your ideas. And these things combined just will naturally build your personal network far beyond the walls of your company. Like, you no longer have to consider the network that you can leverage as just being the people that you've worked closely with in the past. Now it's an entire world of open source of people you've worked with or people who have seen the contributions you've made. And it's also important to note that you can contribute meaningfully in ways other than code. Like, I remember when I was doing Storm, there was one guy he only contributed documentation, but it was the most amazing documentation. And he became really well known in the Storm community for his amazing tutorials that he made. And I remember he then leveraged that to get a new job for himself at one of the big data companies because they were familiar with that aspect of how he could contribute. So in my career, since I had this change in philosophy, I've done a bunch of open source, but there were 3 major open source projects that I did: Cascalog, ElephantDB, and Storm. So I'm sure a lot of people in the room have heard of Storm because it became a very, very big project and very widely used. I bet pretty much no one has ever heard of Cascalog and ElephantDB. But I can say that Storm never would have succeeded the way it did if it wasn't for the lessons I learned with not only Cascalog and ElephantDB, but also everything I learned from all the blogging I did, all the speaking I did, and everything I learned for that. I found that, like, my failures, like, I definitely failed in a lot of ways with my earlier projects and also my earlier writing. But those failures and the things you learn from them, they set you up with the lessons you need to be able to grasp an opportunity when it came to you. And Storm, I mean, it was an opportunity that came to me. I was the first one to realize how how stream processing could be done in a scalable way with total fault tolerance. But Storm never would have succeeded as a project without those lessons I learned. So one lesson I learned, as an example, if we take Cascalog. So Cascalog was a library written in Clojure for doing Hadoop MapReduce jobs. It let you do these things at a very high level of abstraction. It was a really cool project that I'm still really proud of Cascalog. But Cascalog never took off. And the reason it took off was because it was a Clojure library. Clojure is a pretty esoteric language. And so by writing in Clojure and also marketing it and branding it as a Clojure library, it killed any chances that project ever had to be big, because I limited my audience from the start. When I did Storm, I realized that, so Storm was written in Clojure, because I think Clojure is an incredible language, but I did all of Storm's APIs in pure Java to make sure I wasn't limiting my audience before the project even gets off the ground. Now, the other thing that was really important to Storm being successful was everything I learned from doing writing and blogging. Like when I first started writing, I was a horrible writer. I did not know what I was doing. But as I got better at it and I learned how to write more effectively, I basically was learning how to market. And marketing, a lot of programmers think of marketing as kind of this dirty word. But it's actually really important, because people will never use your code unless they understand what it does and how it can help them and whether it's any good. So marketing is really important just to be able to give people the information they need in a way they can consume it. And there were so many lessons I learned from that, which I applied directly to Storm. Now, I do want to note that for me, like, Storm was a side benefit. Like, you don't need to have a huge project, a huge open source project, to benefit from the things I've been talking about. Because if you follow this philosophy, you make your work public, you try to make your value as publicly known as possible, like, good things happen to you. Your network expands, inbound opportunities come to you. Another thing that I found is that working on open source is really rewarding in and of itself, because the work you do affects so much more than just your company. It affects companies all around the world and countries all over the world. And I found that just knowing that my code is running for all these different applications and all these different people is very rewarding in and of itself. And just thinking of your career in this way, it absolutely leads to access to better jobs that you never would have had access to otherwise. Now, for me personally, that's not something I've personally taken advantage of, because I've gone the route of entrepreneurship and building my own company. But I have seen it firsthand. I have personally done a lot of introductions where there were people I knew through open source, and then companies I also knew through open source, and I could see there was a perfect fit between this person, this company, and I provided the intro, and then that person got a job because of their open source work. Now, there's a lot of challenges to approaching your career this way. It's not as easy as I may have made it out to be. The first thing is it does require a lot of discipline, especially the writing aspect. And it can also be quite painful at times. And it's painful just because, by definition, this approach to your career, you're putting yourself out publicly, which means you're putting yourself out publicly to maybe get embarrassed because you don't know what you're doing. It's your first time speaking and you have no idea how to give a talk, and you get nervous and you feel like you embarrass yourself, and that can be very painful. So it requires you to develop, I think anytime you do something you haven't done before, you have to develop a thick skin and be able to power through it and have a willingness to fail so that you can learn and get better. And you do have to grow in a lot of new ways. Like, there's a lot of people who are very good programmers, but they're not very good at writing. They're not very good at communication. And these are skills that are very different than programming. And it's hard. It's hard to learn. Another thing I should mention is that the internet is kind of a scary place, and it's a weird place. I remember I wrote a blog post, I think it was like 4 years ago. It was called How to Beat the CAP Theorem. And it was a post where I was challenging a lot of the conversation there was in the industry about this theorem called the CAP theorem, which was about limits on the kinds of properties that a distributed system can have. And in the post, I was showing that if you architect your systems in different ways, you can avoid a lot of the complexity that is related to dealing with the CAP theorem in our systems. And I worked really hard on this post, and it was a really good post. But I was really surprised by the reception. I was especially surprised when I started getting attacked publicly for this post that I wrote, especially the ways I was being attacked. I remember one person, I had a part of my post where I was talking about, I was doing a thought experiment. So I was imagining a reality which was not reality, but looking at what kind of properties a system would have in this reality, because there were some analogies to the real world. And so this person, I remember, took a quote from my thought experiment section and kind of put it on its own so that it would look ridiculous. They took it out of context and they attacked me with it. And that was a very weird thing for me because that had never happened to me before. Someone quote mining you to try to make you look stupid publicly. I was pretty upset about it at the time. That this guy was not like some random guy with no following, like he was a person who should have known better. So it was kind of a weird thing to be attacked when I thought I was just contributing value to the world. But what happens, especially when you challenge people's views, as I was doing in that post, people can take it personally, and it's kind of weird, and that's the internet. But the thing is that it was worth it. Because that post, a lot of people read that post and they got a lot of value out of it. And that post ended up being like central, it ended up leading like directly to the book that I wrote, which was a big thing for me. There was another one that I'll never forget, that it was just so weird, I'll never forget it. I wrote a post about being the first employee of a Y Combinator startup. And then this was on this is actually looked back. It was still on Hacker News, the comments. And I remember I got this one comment. Remember, it was just a 3-person company, me and the 2 founders. And he said, interesting read, but the details are a bit scary. And one of the scary details he mentioned was that all 3 appear to be single white 20-something males. And then someone responded to him and said, well, why is it bad that they're white? And he said, it's just an additional layer of homogeneity that a prospective teammate will consider before applying. So like inferring that we're like racist somehow or like we're not diverse at a 3-person, it's so insane and ridiculous that that someone would write something like that publicly and not have it filtered out of their mind before they post it. This is, for me, very representative of the internet and some of the weird stuff that you deal with when you're a content creator and a blogger. So when it comes to succeeding in open source, the first thing, the most important thing, is you have to get yourself into a job and a position where you'll have the freedom to be involved in open source. And a good place to start with open source is to contribute to projects you use at work. Almost everyone uses some open source project. So if you use Hadoop very heavily, then look for ways you can improve the project. Ideally, it's something that you need for your company that you can make use of. But even if not, it's a good way to get started and get your feet wet. Now, when it comes to making your own open source project, there's a lot more that you have to do. And this is where the title of this talk comes from, because doesn't matter how good whatever code you produce is. Like you could make a project, like a new programming language that lets people, that gives a 5,000% increase in productivity for any program. But if that's all you do, if you just take that and you put it as open source, no one will care and no one will use it. First of all, documentation is essential for an open source project succeeding. I think with Storm, before I released Storm, I spent an entire month doing nothing but writing tutorials, reference documentation, rationales. I ended up writing more than 12,000 words of documentation before I released Storm. And it's just important. People can't use your code unless they know how to use it and why it's important. And when you blog, you learn the things you need to know for how to make your documentation good and useful and compelling. Another really important thing is that getting started with your project should be as seamless as possible. And ideally, it should be literally brainless to use your project. So again, using Storm as an example, with Storm, I had a companion project called Storm Starter. And it was a project that had some pre-written Storm code that you could run on your computer. And there was a list of commands that you just copy and paste, and you get it running. Once the user can get your stuff running, then they can tweak the code and play with it and start the learning process and start the light bulbs going off as to why is this useful and how could they make use of it. Now when you do a new open source project, the biggest challenge you have on your plate is getting traction on it. And the biggest traction there is this notion of social proof. For most people, they will not use a project unless a lot of other people they know about are using it. And that's kind of a catch-22, because if it's a new project, no one's using it yet. So how do you get people to use it in the first place if you have no social proof to begin with? And how you get around that, well, it varies per project. With Storm, what I did is our startup got acquired by Twitter. One of the reasons why I wanted to be acquired by Twitter was so that I could use the Twitter brand in promoting Storm and say, oh, this is a Twitter project, which helps you get around some of the social proof problems in the early days. So now when it comes to writing, what I like to say about that is that you should blog even if you have no readers. And what I mean by that is that there are so many advantages to writing, so many personal benefits, besides the things I've been talking about, like getting your value out publicly and having reach for your ideas and things like that. So something I have found, so like I've written, I have some number of blog posts on my blog, and I probably have 10 times as many unfinished drafts of posts that I'll never publish. But I personally got a lot of value out of writing every single one of them. Because what I found is that when you have an idea that's just in your head, it can seem like a really good idea. And you could be really excited about it and think it's smart and interesting or whatever. And I found that as soon as you put it on paper and your idea is looking back at you, you suddenly see all these holes in your idea that you didn't see before. And this forces you as a person to think more about it, think through the cases you didn't think of, and make it a better idea that's more robust to these challenges to it that you see when it's on paper. And that aspect of writing has made me like so much more thoughtful as a person. And I thought I was thoughtful before, but what I learned is that I wasn't. And writing really helped me with that. Now when it comes to writing well, like you're not gonna learn to write well. Like no matter what I say here, nothing I say here will make you a good writer. You can only learn through experience. But I will say that what makes someone a good writer is how empathetic they are to their audience. How do they understand how their audience thinks? I used to think, and partially this was because of how I was taught in school, that writing was about putting your ideas down on paper in a logical way. You say your main idea and you support it with supporting points, and you lay it out like almost like a mathematical proof. It turns out that is basically the worst way to write. because people, your audience, almost no one thinks completely logically. People have preconceived notions, preconceived ideas. People think in a million different fallacious ways. So if you want to write well, you have to take that into account, understand your audience, and write in a way so that you can get around those things. Now, when it comes to becoming a speaker, I really recommend everyone in this room to try to do public speaking. Best place to start is at meetups. Meetup for a programming language or technology that you use. It's a pretty low pressure environment. There's not any time pressure. And also, at meetups, you can usually do a very short talk. It's not like a conference where your talk has to be 40, 50 minutes. So it's just a good environment to get started. And there's a very willing audience there to listen to you. A good topic to start with, I find, are just doing case studies. So you go into the Python meetup and you talk about how you use Python at your company. And usually those kinds of talks are usually very well received, and then obviously you would have a lot to say about it because it's very close to home. Another thing I will mention, something that I got a lot of personal value out of, to become a better speaker, although it's definitely not for everyone. Also, I don't know if this is much of a thing in the Netherlands, is stand-up comedy. A few years ago, I did stand-up for like 3 months, just forced myself to go to open mics, get on stage, do 5-minute sets, and it's a scary thing to do. It's actually, I would say, the most brutal thing I've ever done, but it really goes a long way in making you a better speaker. And then the last two things I'll say, is that I find that doing all these things that aren't coding, writing, tweeting, speaking, I find that these things, even though they're not coding, they make you a better engineer. Because engineering, programming, I would say that more like the coding aspect of it, it's less than half of what we do. Like most of what we do is communication. It's explaining to your teammates, should we build it in this way? Why should we use this technology? Explaining to other teams, what have you built that they can use and how can they make use of it? And unfortunately, a lot of engineers are just not very good at communication, and I find it really limits them. And then the other thing is that this process of making your work public, it will push your boundaries, because it will make you do things you haven't done before. And I found that to be a very humbling process. Like for me, I've been programming since I was 10 years old. I was always very, very good at programming. So I had a lot of confidence in that. But then I started doing these new things, and then I realized, oh, I'm not so good at these things. I'm doing something now that I'm failing at in many ways. And that really humbles you as a person. And it's really good to get humbled, I've found. And that aspect of living your career in this way, I really think it does make you a better person and also a happier person. So I made it through the talk. I can still speak. I hope I have inspired at least a few of you to think about your careers in a different way, and I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you very much.